Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics. I'm Lin and...
I'm Joe.
I have a story for you. I was driving to the store, just cruising along, and this gnawing feeling started in my mind. I can't really explain it, it just was there in my head. I was being directed to call a lady I know. Now, I consider her my friend, but not the sort you call up and share weird things with. I had a specific message. I felt compelled to tell her about a family member of hers. I don't actually remember the message because it didn't feel like it was a message for me, so I don't remember it. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer, and I pulled over and did this second best thing to calling her. I gave her the message in a text. Just a little while later, she called me and she said the message was well received. The family member that I had the message about was very sick, and my message gave the rest of the family peace. I didn't know her family member, and I had no knowledge that she was sick. Just weird.
Well, what do you, like, you were just driving along?
I was actually between Spooner and Shell Lake, and that whole time it just was in my head. I've got to call her. I had this message, and it was just the weirdest thing. I can't even explain it. It was just weird.
I mean, you just had a thought, and then the thought felt very important, or you just had a sense.
I just had the sense I had to call her and tell her this. Whatever it was,
And you don't remember.
I don't remember. It was about
that's
a family
pretty cool.
member of hers. So that was one of...
It's like clairvoyance or something, but it's just that you didn't know the fact.
I didn't know the fact. And I think that might be one of the important things about psychic stuff, is that do they know all the details? If they know the details, then it might not be psychic. It might just be reading all the details.
Yeah.
But if they don't know the details, then
they have to get that information from somewhere.
Right. So another story that's a personal story, although it didn't happen to me, it happened to my mom. So it was the middle of the night, and my mom was asleep, and she woke up with a jolt, and she was freezing cold, and she had the sense of being in water and not able to breathe. So she panicked. She went to my oldest brother's room, David's room, and saw he wasn't home. Earlier the night before, he'd gone out for a boat ride in his kayak on the lake. Obviously, he'd never come home.
How old was he?
He was an adult.
Oh,
Late teens, early 20s.
So he's been boating for a long time.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that. I thought that was a later thing, hobby of his.
No. So my mom did not go back to sleep. She was completely freaked out. She was worried sick. And even though the sensation of being in cold water slowly went away, her sense of urgency and terror grew. Finally, early in the morning...
I mean, she knows he's not there, and she knows he went out. So that, the sense of, from just those facts, I would be thinking, holy shit.
So, but she'd never felt that way before. She'd never felt that way before when he went out on the lake. So finally...
Is this before cell phones?
Yes.
Vastly before.
You might have been able to have what they called a bag phone, which cost $1,000 and, was iffy. So finally, in the early morning hours, my brother came home, and this is the story he said. He'd been out on the lake, and his boat had capsized. He couldn't swim. And he couldn't swim? No, he still can't swim.
He can't swim?
No.
What? Does he sink? Is he one of those people who just sinks?
I think he might be. He has...
Because he has a dense...
Yeah, he's got a lot of muscle. So he hung on to the boat.
That's crazy.
And it was upside down.
He's done it all those years. He can't swim.
Yeah. So he just hung on, and it was upside down, and he stayed that way until finally a motorboat came along, probably some early morning fishermen, and they towed him back towards shore until he could find his footing and get out of the water. He said the water was ice cold, and he was scared.
Yeah. What time of year was it?
Probably it was winter.
It must have been.
It had to be, because for the water to be
How
cold.
would the water not be warm if it wasn't?
Right. But the point of the story, Joe, is
she had
this. It wasn't even a dream. She woke up freezing, feeling like she was in cold water and she couldn't breathe.
And she did. So, I mean, I know you only have limited facts about it, but was it like she just inferred, like she had a sense, not she had a sense specifically about him, but because she felt that way, she inferred it's about him?
I don't know that she knew it was about him, but she inferred it was about him when she saw he didn't come home.
Yeah. Yeah. That actually, I mean, to me, you know, if the explanation for that is definitively some kind of paranormal thing, that gives a lot of more credibility to that than anything. Not knowing some detail,
Right.
that's important to, you know.
So those two stories are examples of psychic whatever.
And to categorize it further, it's like getting information about something where suddenly there's no obvious channel how you're getting that information.
Right. So I looked up what Wikipedia says about it, and this is what psychic means. And it said a psychic is a person who claims to use extrasensory perception, or ESP. Some people call it, I think they pronounce it psi.
Psi. It comes from the Greek letter psi.
Oh, okay.
Which I can't remember why they started using the Greek letter psi. But the psi stuff, if you look at psychology, that's probably why. It's psychology.
Oh.
It's psychology, but it just happens that the Greek letter is called psi.
Okay.
So that's probably why.
ESP identifies information hidden from the normal senses. It also refers to a person who can perform the acts that are apparently inexplicable, not necessarily deliberately, but they can perform those acts that are inexplicable by natural laws.
They can predict they're going to do it, or they can consistently do it.
Not necessarily.
By invoking it?
No, someone who does this is a psychic.
Yeah, but it implies it's like this person is someone who knows they do it.
Well, it may imply that, but that's not what it means.
Okay.
Okay. It's also used as an adjective to describe those abilities. Most people, like 70% of people, believe in psychic abilities. They believe in ESP. But the scientific consensus is that there's no proof of the existence of such powers and describe the practice as a pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, I have a story for you about that. Okay. So psychics might use devices such as cards, like tarot cards, crystal balls, which we've talked about.
Scrying, yeah.
Yeah. Or trances to elicit their information.
Which is the meditative state where they're presumably deeply in their own heads.
Or somewhere.
But like in a more mental state.
Yeah. They might also get messages when they're asleep or suddenly in the middle of an activity like I did while driving. Their messages might be extremely clear and obvious, or they might feel like they have to decipher them.
Mm-hmm.
So this, and I mentioned this already, a survey of people who believe in paranormal topics. So 70% believe in ESP, 26% believe in clairvoyance. I'm not sure what the difference between...
I always thought clairvoyance was like looking at some distant situation.
Okay, let me see what they are referring to when they say clairvoyance. It's the ability to gain information about an object, person, location, or physical event through ESP. So that doesn't really...
They're the same then.
Yeah, they're the same. So that doesn't make any sense. But maybe to the people that they polled, it made...
Yeah.
There was some distinction. But 31% of the people surveyed believe in telepathy or psychic communication.
And telepathy is mind reading.
Yeah, being able to tell what somebody else
There's a distinction there, though. Empathetic telepathy, so you can get a sense of somebody's feelings and emotions, right, versus like hard, you're mirroring their thoughts, so you can just hear their thoughts.
Did you read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell?
I don't know. I can't remember if I did. It was a long time ago.
He talked about micro expressions and how
you can get information really quick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in these two cases of mine and my mom's, we obviously were not doing that because
completely.
We weren't there.
No matter how you're getting the information, it's really interesting. I mean, consider the completely conventional physicalist interpretation, which is you were exposed to that information at some point, and it was just in like little tiny bits or through like a really roundabout way you got that information. So like you pieced it together based on just tiny hints, or you like heard just barely audible someone saying something a block away, and it was just in your subconscious. So it's in your brain, but you don't have conscious access to it. But even that's crazy. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's
you
remarkable.
know, a common thing, obviously, is people who believe it's a paranormal thing, they don't go into any further detail, not even speculative, like details on speculation what it could be. You obviously are getting the information somehow, right?
Right.
Even in like completely exotic universe, you know, it's idealism, like a multi-view associative universe, whatever, crazy shit. And the information is still transferring. The information means something different in a weird universe, but in a physical universe, the information is things like, oh, the relative position of particles and energy fields in this possible configuration versus this possible configuration. So an information really is an effect you've had on something else. Now, you ask a conventional physicist, they say, 1, nothing can go faster than the speed of light. 2, the more diffuse the interaction between physical processes, the less information, meaningful information will be transferred. That's another important one. Although they'll also say 2 distant systems can be entangled, quote unquote, which means you can get statistical information about the other one based on observations that you're making on yours. And there's subtleties that rule out basically normal understandings about that. Like, for instance, here's speculation. You have a little tiny like portal in your brain and it goes to another person's brain and there's like an exchange of electrical activity. You know what I mean? I mean, that's like pretty like cut and dry. It's speculative, but you can see how it works. You can picture it. You could do an experiment if you knew where that little portal was. But the information is still is going across from your brain to their brain or whatever.
I've got a couple more stories, and then in the next section, I'm going to tell you about a study.
Okay.
One lady on the internet said, she said she was standing at her kitchen window, and in her mind's eye, she could see her son putting his dog in the back of his truck. She said then she could see the dog jump out and dangle by his leash while her son continued driving across the field. She just thought, this is nonsense. And she went away from the window, and in her mind's eye, she was standing at her window, in her kitchen window, and in her mind's eye, she saw this.
So she imagined it.
Probably the same way I got the message that I needed to call that lady. So she wandered away from the window, and then a little while later, she came back, and she literally saw, right then, as she came back to the window, she literally saw, not in her mind's eye, but literally, her son driving across the field, and the dog in the back of the truck. And then the dog bounced out of the truck and was being dragged. But because she was on alert, she ran out there, was able to stop him, and the dog was fine.
Because she already was like primed that she would see it and what she would do. So she had that in her head. Another lady, she said, to the question on Quora, I think, have you ever gotten a psychic reading? She said I'm going to read in first person. I'm going to read what she said. I asked for a mediumship reading, expecting my dead husband to come through, but instead a female energy appeared. The psychic said that it's not so much that she entered the room, it was her emotions. The psychic said that she first felt love and then saw the actual words, I love her, I love her, I love her. I wondered who it was, not having lost any female loved ones. Then she asked, were you left in charge? I tried to think what that meant, but nothing came to mind. The psychic pointed to her notes. Child, female. Yes, I have a stepdaughter. She's 17. Her mom died 5 years ago. The psychic asked, do you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders over this child? And I answered, yes, she and I had gone through a rough period, so the answer was yes. The psychic said, you need to let it go. You're doing the best you can. Here is an example of how a psychic can guide somebody by asking questions and getting responses. And so that one I'm suspicious of. But the lady said she felt it was really significant and it helped her a lot. And apparently the person who had come through for the psychic was the stepdaughter's, some relative of the stepdaughter. So it wasn't somebody that the lady getting the reading knew. Somebody the stepdaughter would have known. So she felt it brought her a lot of healing. That's great. Except that I think if you have a teenager living with you, you could say that to almost anybody and get
kind of the same thing. So I don't know about that one. And then there was another one where a girl was 17. Her mom had a psychic party, whatever the hell that is.
Is it like one of the, like a seance where they all get together around the table and
you hire a psychic to come and talk to you? I don't know.
It'd be entertaining.
And
anything.
And she said nobody knew she was going to be at this party. There was no prior information by the psychic about her. She was sure of it. And during the course of it, near the end of the reading, the psychic abruptly changed the subject. She was just saying general things. And she told her mom that she had a daughter that was becoming an adult soon and was 2 to 3 weeks pregnant. And the girl did not know she was pregnant at that time. Her mom certainly didn't know she was pregnant. And it turned out she was in fact pregnant. So that was interesting. And the woman went into a lot of details about why she didn't think she could have been pregnant, but she was in fact pregnant. And if you're sexually active, I don't care who you are, there's a good chance you could be pregnant. So that was silliness on her part, ignorance. So there's some questions for you. Now, I usually am the skeptic as far as scientific studies because I feel like we're just little babies in the woods and there's so much we don't know. And so when somebody says this scientific study proved this, it's like, yeah.
So I do have something quickly to say on that note. When you perform a scientific study, you're essentially recording all of the context of what you did, the setting, everything. A lot of it's implicit, but what you want to do is create a situation that is repeatable. The problem with studies, all scientific studies, is that they inherently are taking place in the structure of a scientific study. So that's in contrast to you just living your life is completely unstructured. If there is any phenomena that for whatever reason won't appear or won't occur in that structured setting, for whatever reason, science cannot explain it, can't observe it, it can't appear in the scientific method. Now you can collect lots of data about it, but it has to be unstructured stuff. So that means super rare events, science cannot handle those. Super personal events, science can't handle those. There's a lot that science can't handle just because of that.
Daryl Bem, a professor of psychology at Cornell University, which is a good university, published a study on ESP in 2010. He refers to it in his study, which I skimmed. I did not read because studies are boring. So he calls it psi. And he measured participants' ability to anticipate an event, which is about the only way you could probably conduct a study, especially considering what you just said, because it's got to be something that they can duplicate and put in a lab. He worked on that study, the longest he ever worked on any study in his career. He worked on it for 8 years.
Is he legit?
He's legit. He's a
tenured professor
of psychology, yes. So rather than present a stimulus and then measure a subject's response, Bem measured the subject's response before the stimulus was presented. So,
interesting.
Yeah. In some earlier experiments by other psi researchers, participants were hooked up to psychological measuring equipment similar to a lie detector, which makes sense. That would be a good way to do it, that measured emotional arousal. They sat before a computer and watched randomly selected images. Some were erotic or very negative, like bloody photos you might see on CSI.
And they're measuring their emotional response.
Yes. Your physiology jumps when you see one of those pictures after watching a series of landscapes or neutral pictures. So you're watching landscapes go by,
and then they just
randomly throw in a murder scene. And Bem said, but the remarkable finding is that your physiology jumps before the provocative picture actually appears on the screen. So your body actually reacts before the picture appears.
It's really interesting. Okay, so there's like a minute change in the electrical field inside the screen or something.
Okay, it's randomized.
Even that is super interesting.
Yeah, well, the computer program, it's randomized. Even before the computer decides what picture is going to come up, these people, they had a response on the machinery that he had. And he believed that it was showing that your physiology can anticipate an upcoming event even though your conscious self couldn't tell. So that was pretty interesting. And he duplicated it. He had 9
Have
different...
others duplicated it? No?
I don't know. He had 9 different experiments that he did that confirmed his hypothesis that psi exists. Well, there was one that was a failure.
Is he saying psi as in like a process, or like, is that a noun?
He's just using psi to replace
Just like a
ESP.
general... Okay, yeah, I see.
The odds against the combined results of all of those tests due to chance or statistical flukes was about 74 billion to 1. So there was the chances of it being a fluke were it's not. It wasn't a fluke. Something was happening there. So I thought that was really pretty interesting, especially in light of what you just said about how studies are conducted and about how researchers do their research. So what do you think about that?
I mean, there are potentially mechanisms for like modern physics to explain it. They're still exotic, and even if you think like you don't take any exotic mechanisms into account, like quantum physics for instance, it's still completely crazy if they can like sense like a sound that the computer is making as its CPU, it goes into a different part of its program. I mean, it's like, that would be crazy. They're still getting that information to tell them what's going to happen. But even that would be amazing, you know?
Yeah.
But so the really interesting thing about if you know information about stuff that's going to happen, so we're not talking about clairvoyance in space, we're talking about clairvoyance in time. If you can get information about stuff that's going to happen, you open up a can of worms. Even if you go from a conventional perspective to an expanded metaphysical perspective, whatever, now you're in like a whole class of crazy shit you can do. Like, for instance, if you can time travel, so that means if you can go like back in time, so you are bringing information from the future back. You can do things like choose to prevent something that you know happened. Now, there potentially are mechanisms in physics to prevent those time-like loops. And it's like would be fairly chaotic. Like you would go to kill your, like the grandfather paradox, you'd go to kill your grandpa, and your arm would just explode for no reason, you know? And like, for instance, if you know you are psychic and you can tell what the lottery numbers are, that's like just the tip of the iceberg. You could do much crazier stuff. Like you could see what you're going to do and then like not do that, you know, or like gradually change what you're intending to goal seek to completely insane futures.
I have a question and then I have a comment about that.
Okay.
So the question is, when you talk about being able to see, like you said, distance and time.
Yeah. So in space and in time.
Okay. Space would be the two examples, my mom's and my examples.
Yeah. So your mom was seeing stuff
that was happening somewhere else.
That currently happening or happened.
And I wasn't seeing anything, but I was sensing something. And then time would be being able to anticipate what these pictures are. My questions about this study are, were these people chosen as subjects or participants because they had already demonstrated some
or were they
talent towards this?
Acquire that while they were doing it?
Right. Or did they get better over the 9 experiments? Were all of them done?
Presumably it's like any other skill. You can improve on it.
Right. I was interested in that. I was also interested in, well, I think I already said that if they get better over there were 9 different experiments they did for these the same people. If they weren't the same people, then were they just random people, students, like they do when they say, yeah, you get $5 if you come in and do this and take an hour. That was a question that in what I read, and I'm sure it was in there somewhere, but what I read, I did not see that answer.
So humans have like a superhuman ability to predict when things are happening based on observations previously. So like we're really good at detecting the correlation in time intervals. So like, for instance, if there was a bias in his program showing the images on screen, the people could have picked up on that. That's still very impressive. If there was a bias in anyone present, like they knew it could also, that information could...
It sounds like there wasn't, because it was the computer was randomizing the pictures.
Oh, and another thing, this is a technical thing, but if you're not using a randomizer called a true randomizer or whatever they call it, that uses like cosmic rays or radiation or whatever to produce random numbers, it is technically true that you can predict a random number generator. If you have the current state of the random number generator, you can predict every state in the future. Now, if they were doing that, that's completely nuts. The question, okay, which is crazier? That your fucking astral mind is going out, reaching out in time and space and attaching to a different situation, or you can detect unbelievably specific and precise information. I mean, it's like...
Either one is just absolutely
So, many worlds interpretation, a lot of people don't believe in it. It's not... Well, belief is the wrong word. Some people have faith in it, but it's like no one has proven it. It might not be something that you can prove. At least not like how we normally think of things being proven. But many worlds interpretation, it's conceivable that if it's true, then the random number generator is producing a random number or a random image. You in a different, essentially, world sees it and then interacts with, exchanges information with the one you're on, the one you're perceiving, the world you're perceiving. So there's information transfer across essentially your wave function in quantum mechanical space. That's still pretty crazy. You could go even crazy. I mean, like, you know, the sky's the limit. But the one thing you have to satisfy is there's information transfer.
There's definitely information transfer. And there are enough cases, this doctor's study just being one example, but there are plenty of cases throughout history of people doing this over and over and over. And I think that a lot of people have these experiences and they'll label them as, I had a hunch, or I just had a feeling, or whatever that is. But I've talked to many people over the years, many people who will tell me something that happened. They say, you know, they had this experience that, to me, what they're saying sounds like a psychic experience.
Yeah.
So there's something to it, but what it is...
I also wonder, so there's a bias towards the visibility or you remembering things that worked out. You know, they were surprising. So, like, if you remember, I thought the car is going to come down the road right before I walked out the street, you know, and then so I stopped and then the car did come across, you know. But how many times do you think a car is going to cross the street and it doesn't do that? And that wasn't surprising. So you have a bias towards, like, noticing a correlation there.
This is true. And so I think it's important to look at the facts of a story when you hear it from somebody. And that's why I think that the TV psychics are questionable, because they do have access to a lot of information beforehand. You know, people who have dreams, prophetic dreams, is that being psychic? Is prophecy different from being psychic? I don't know. I don't know in the minds of people who believe such things. Not that I don't believe it, because I do believe in it. I've experienced it. You know, I think that you really have to almost experience it to believe it. Because... Or
to be convinced that there's something there.
You know, like, I'll talk to David and he'll say he doesn't believe any of that stuff. He doesn't believe any of it. And it's not even so much that it hasn't happened to him. I think that also you have to notice that it happened. Like the car across the road thing. Okay, it's true. You're probably going to notice it if it's connected to something you already thought. But if it's something remarkable, like you have a thought that a car is going to come down the road that has a giant red arrow painted on the side and a flower on the antenna, specific. And then that car comes down the road, you're probably going to say, maybe there's something to that I had that thought.
You also have to consider that if you did think in that scenario, you know, the arrow and the flower or whatever, and then it happens. At what point did you actually have the thought that it would come? For instance, it's conceivable that you actually had the thought that it would come after it came.
Oh, that's true.
And you just thought it came before it came.
That is absolutely true. And I think that a lot of cases it is that. I think that that's why the situations where somebody sits down in front of somebody who is a self-professed psychic, and that psychic tells them something, in this moment in time, the psychic tells them something, and then later that thing happens, and there's witnesses to the psychic telling them that something.
Yeah,
I think
that's more important.
That seems more believable.
Yeah.
A psychic telling you something that has already happened isn't as believable to me, because I think that they could, like you were talking about all the little cues you might be picking up on of electronics. Well, physically, we're giving off cues all the time, and who knows what can be picked up on. My mom picking up on my brother being out in the lake, well, she did have some cues. She was asleep, yes, but she maybe at some level knew that he didn't come inside, come in from the lake, and so there were some other things. But my situation,
you had no way of knowing.
I've documented it because I texted somebody in that time, and the phone call back, and I didn't know these people. I had absolutely no information whatsoever about what that family was going through in that moment. You have to make those distinctions. So just to say I had this psychic event, well, in what way was it psychic? Did you understand something that you shouldn't have had any knowledge about, something that had already happened? Or did you understand something that you shouldn't have any knowledge about, and then it happened? And can you pinpoint when that happened, and can you somehow document it, if only for yourself? That's why writing down your dreams is important. And if you have those impressions, to write them down, because then you've documented a point in time when that occurred, so that when it happens later, you can look back and say, oh,
yeah, there's evidence.
Maybe not to anybody else, but
it's like the rape case, where a rape case later is more believable when that person had actually gone to like a therapist or a friend and said, this happened to me.
Are you talking about Trump's rape case?
Yeah, what's her name?
I don't. Jean Carroll.
Jean or something.
Yeah, something Jean Carroll.
Jean Carroll. Yeah.
Yeah. But she did tell people.
Yeah, so that's what, like, in court, you're trying to prove something.
Right.
That's what you look for. It's not really enough, at least hopefully in most cases, for someone to just say this is what happened.
Yeah.
People are just notoriously unreliable, horribly unreliable. It's one of those things, like, people are terrible at predicting things. Terrible. So then you have somebody who comes and, like, they listen to the fucking CPU in 5 nanoseconds switch to generate a random number, and they can predict the thing. That's crazy if that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I was curious about what kind of people he had as participants in his study, because they're just regular people. Well, okay, you might assume that they were college students. Maybe they weren't college students. Just because they're college students doesn't mean they're smart, because somewhere out there, as my mom was fond of telling me, there was a doctor or a lawyer or something with an IQ of 80.
Yeah.
She'd read some statistic. So that didn't mean anything.
Every distribution has outliers or extreme ends. Even like, oh, there's a rocket scientist out there who is on the lower end, and it's like really low.
Really low. So, yeah.
When people are doing hallucinogenic drugs, not necessarily psychedelic, hallucinogenic. In the past, like Native Americans or whomever, that would be like one way they would, experience things psychically. So they would see things or know the rains are coming or whatever. But nowadays, that's absolutely not how it is. A lot of people do all sorts of hallucinogens, and there's insight, but it's like personal insight.
Right.
Like 99 times
but that might be
more out of 100.
Some change in social consciousness too.
Yeah, so if it's like you think you can do this thing, then it's like the placebo effect. Like if you think it, then it's the truth.
Okay, so as far back as history has gone, in the Bible, further back, I'm sure if you were an archaeologist and you looked at and deciphered a site, you would be able to see that there was somebody there that was considered a soothsayer. Is that how you say it? Which is just a psychic. That's all it is.
Well, oracles too.
Yeah. So as
prophets.
As human beings, we've kind of embraced this for a really long time.
People who have insights beyond what anyone else can see.
Right. And maybe they're people who just really can pick up nonverbal cues.
Or whatever.
Or maybe they're really good at what do they call that?
Cold reading.
Cold reading. But interestingly, or not, but predictably, TV has capitalized on psychics being on TV. So there have been lots of programs over the years. Now, if you get on TikTok, there are at any time, day or night, live readings will come up, like live as in it's live, and you can type in your little question, and if you're lucky enough, they'll see your name, and I have never done that, but I've seen it come up on TikTok. I looked at an article about famous TV psychics, and because I just don't really watch TV that much, I didn't identify many of them. One of them was named Miss Cleo, and it says she had a fake Jamaican accent.
She does, or you think she did?
It said she had a pseudo-Jamaican accent that a lot of people thought was fake. She's a black woman, and she sounded like she was from Jamaica, but people thought it was fake. So I don't know if it was really fake or not. She was apparently really famous. She died in 2016. Never seen any of her videos.
Did she predict
don't know
that?
About.
Did she predict it?
I don't know if she predicted it. Right now, there's somebody named Tyler Henry, who is apparently a Gen Z wonder and can communicate with dead people. So a lot of these psychics, that's what they're saying they're doing, is communicating with dead people and then giving you messages.
So that really interesting thing about the communication with dead people is that's not even it's like I said earlier, clairvoyance in space, clairvoyance in time. That's neither of those.
Yeah.
Because you would have to have a model of what's happening with the ghosts or the astral realm or whatever the hell.
Right.
And you don't.
So I would say these are more mediums than psychics.
Medium is a intermediate between one thing and the other.
Right. Although this says they're psychics, I would say they're more mediums. But I'm going to go ahead and go along with this because what they do is what psychics do. So the one that I'm familiar with, the only one of these I think that I'm familiar with, is John Edward.
Oh, yeah, John Edward.
I used to watch his television program. I found it highly entertaining. And although sometimes I thought what he had to say seemed remarkable, seemed like, well, maybe he's on to something. For the most part, I think he was doing cold readings. So you familiar with what a cold reading is?
Yeah, you're explicitly picking up on signals and then using that feedback to refine what you're saying about the person and get more information and
I think it's actually
all cold. You don't know anything about them.
Yeah, I think it's actually a conversational skill to be able to have a conversation with somebody.
It's an empathetic skill, I think.
And to say,
because it's useful more than just like pulling a trick on people. Like if you need to know something from somebody and they don't know how to express it, it would be massively important.
Right. And so most of these, I think that's exactly what they're doing. In the case of the woman who said that her mom had the psychic party and the psychic said the thing about her being pregnant, that one was kind of like, well, because she was talking to the mom. How would the mom know that? The mom didn't know those things. But the other one where she said, I'm getting a female's presence. And the woman said, well, I don't have any female relatives who have passed away. And she said, well, do you have a female in your life? Okay. Yeah. Do you have a troubled person in your life? You start picking away, and it is human nature to expand.
You
on
ever
your
played
answer.
20 questions?
Yes.
20 questions,
I thought maybe
same
that was a
shit.
question.
What is it? A yes or no answers 2 to the 20th power is so huge.
Yeah. If you're a good question asker. Some people are really awful at it. But I think...
Well, it's because they're asking essentially the same question multiple times. They're not like ablating the answer space enough. They're like, just take a little bit off. Like, is your thing larger than a car? And then they say, yes. Is your thing larger than a bus? Like, you haven't eliminated enough.
Right.
And same with cold reading. The optimal scenario is you ask a minimal set of questions in sequence, and each one informs you enough to get to the answer really fast.
I think also that human nature being what it is, if you ask an open-ended question, people do more than just answer yes or no.
It's an open-ended question. It's not just yes or no. So it might be not just 1, 2, yes, no. It might be like 20 25 different possible answers.
Right.
It takes nothing.
If somebody
to get
asked me, I'm getting a mail presence, have you lost?
Yeah, and then they have like an
one?
emotional reaction. They respond to that.
And I could say, yes, I have. Well, I can think of several male people in my life that have died. But let's say I only had one, and it's like, oh, yes, I'm thinking about, my Uncle Sam, and it was so sad how he died. They've got a lot of information right there.
I'm feeling it was very painful.
Yes, he died from pancreatic cancer.
Yeah,
oh my
exactly.
God.
And that's 2 questions.
Yeah. And now you know that they had their Uncle Sam died of pancreatic cancer. He was in a lot of pain. You could assume he was in the hospital.
And now you have an in.
Right. And now you say, he's saying, I just wanted to go home. You can say, well, but he died at home. But he kept saying he wanted to go back to the farm. Well, now you know he was a farm boy. I mean, there's lots of different ways that can manipulate people into giving more information than they intended to give away. But I don't really think that's being psychic.
If you have the psychic ability to, like, on the order of reading, like, CPU instructions, then your ability to cold read is assuredly completely insane. Like, you could see individual molecules moving on their forehead and determine their whole life story.
Yeah. So one of the things John Edward used to do, which was really pretty funny, is he'd have this big audience, big television audience, and I guess he did in-person things also at venues, but the ones I saw would be a big TV audience. This says there would be 60 people, so I'm not going to dispute that there were 60 people. And he'd say, I'm getting the message that from somebody who died of a heart attack. Who here has a loved one? Yeah.
Like, what are the chances? 1 in 60? That means there's one fucking person with any rare thing happening.
But then he's even saying, who here, raise your hand if you've had a loved one die of a heart attack.
And then he can just look over, look at that guy.
Okay, their name starts with an L. Anybody whose loved one started with an L?
Yeah.
I mean, you're just...
It's really... I mean, it's an interesting game.
It is a fun game. I wish I could play that game, but
if you took a kid really young and you just played this game with them, and you just made them really good at it. You just started training them. And
then you just go pimp them out.
And then, of course, teach them how to not be a horrible person. And then they'd be like they could just walk into a room. It could be the ultimate.
So let me just suggest this. You could start training yourself right now, and you could do that. Would you want to do that? No, I wouldn't either.
This is a really important principle. I may have said this before. If there is a ghost
in our house,
so if there was a chance I could hear a bump and then just run maximum speed around the corner and see Glenn the ghost and prove he exists as a ghost, and the amount of information you get from that is extreme. That should be your number one priority, is to prove things that are essentially unproven by anybody else. To be extremely surprised, because you get a tremendous amount of information about the universe. If there was a program I could do to develop the skill of clairvoyance, if I could develop the skill of temporal clairvoyance, looking forward in time, hell, looking even backward in time, that is extremely
maybe you can. Maybe there is a method to do that.
There's this kind of idea that this is how the things are and how they've always been. We live on Earth, and here we live in this town, and 100 years ago this was going on, and whatever. There's in-system evidence for that. Meaning, if you already accept that, then in that framework there is evidence for that. But there's no actually inherent reason why it has to be true. For instance, the moment you are born, the universe just comes into existence with its history and everything already just meshed together as if it had a history, but there really was no history. There's no nothing is stopping that from being the case.
And you can't
and you literally cannot prove it.
You can't prove it or disprove it.
So if at some point you develop the skill to look forward in time, and you could use recurrent time-like loops to gain more and more information, and you just become a fucking god and completely bypass all of modern physics and everything. There's actually nothing inherently stopping you. If it's possible to look forward in time,
okay, so
those are the sorts of things that are possible.
So consider this. If it can happen once, and it has happened to me several times in my lifetime where I had a thought or a dream, documented it through one means or another, and then it took place, I know that it really was in some way prophetic. If it can happen once, that means that it is a natural thing that occurs, right? So that means that it should be a skill that you can duplicate.
You don't necessarily have to get better at it if you do it. And it's not necessarily based on the stories you've told, anything that isn't something you can deliberately induce. You know, you can cause that to happen. Other than the cold reading,
Okay, so people who are self-professed psychics, who seem to have a pretty good track record. Now, I don't know anybody like that, but I'm sure there are people that do, because there are people...
Did they notice they had that ability and then just used it? Or did they deliberately go through and improve it and improve it?
Well,
and it may be that improvement
point.
isn't actually improving the incidence of it. It's just you getting better at noticing it.
Or it could be you getting better at presenting it. So
and keep in mind, the noticing thing, it could be that if you are literally always in tune with everything, clairvoyance in space, clairvoyance in forward time, backward time, everything, but you only momentarily have access to it, or maybe you always have access to it.
Well, maybe you do have access to it, but maybe that there's enough other static in your brain, you know.
Yeah, that's the other thing. If there's noise on the line between the source of the information and you, then it's entirely dependent on the signal to noise ratio.
Can you come up with just a thought of what could be taking place outside of our understanding?
So, like, outside of conventional physics. Like understanding of how the models we use to explain to predict how the universe will behave. Outside those.
Well, if it has to be outside of those, then yeah, I guess so.
It has to be outside of those. And if it's not, like quantum physics, what I would say is probably it's you're stepping out of physicalism. You can't have physicalism, or the physicalism wouldn't make sense. So that means they're even like ignoring the models we use to predict the universe, how it will behave, that there's not even an expanded model to predict how the universe is. So like, for instance, an expanded physicalist universe would mean there are astral bodies, and there's an astral plane, and you can go to your body and float around, and sometimes your astral body stretches and looks at something distant, and Idealism is the opposite of physicalism. That means your mind is the only thing, minds are the only thing that are inherent to the universe. And that's kind of a squishy, soft thing. It's a concept that in and of itself, it doesn't need like a super hard definition.
Okay.
Like your mind then can do anything. Like if you perceive it, that's essentially equivalent to that actually having happened, because your mind is the only thing that necessarily requires having happened.
Here's a thought. What if, okay, this is really conspiracy theory, weird shit. What if there's actually two different things going on at the same time? And there's one group of people who are operating on this other level. And there's the other group of people that are they're just physical. They're just here. They're just da-da-da-da-da.
So you're saying like, there's physical bodies, and then there's other bodies that are not, you can't describe them as physical.
No, I'm saying there are two different entities. For instance, there's cats and there's dogs. Mm-hmm. And let's say the dogs are just like, they're just walking along, sniffing trees. They're just living their life. And the cats are communicating in some other, like a river of information that's flowing over everything. and they can access that.
But they have a physical body.
But they have a physical body. And the cats and the dogs live in the same world, and they're interacting.
That would mean like some people have it, some people don't have it.
Yeah.
So there's no other traits so operating within the framework of physicalism, there's a physical universe, there's a model, even if we don't know what it is, to predict what will happen in that physical universe. So there are things that can cause things to happen, you know? Mm-hmm. Even if they're like astral bodies, it's just a different type of physics, you know? Mm-hmm. There's no traits that we know of for humans that aren't just shared by everyone because we evolved and, you know.
So what if it's more like intelligence that, okay, so some people are smart, mm-hmm. some people are not as smart, some people can understand more complicated concepts. Some people simply cannot. Mm-hmm. Some people have creative ability. Some people don't have very much creative ability. They might, mm-hmm. You might be able to put somebody who can't draw down in front of a piece of paper and teach them how to hold a pencil and how to make a stroke. And they might come up with things, but they're probably never going to have the talent. Mm-hmm. And talent is probably the key word here of Rembrandt, mm-hmm. because they don't, that is just something that's not innately in them. Mm-hmm. Yes, all people can technically draw, but some people, they have the talent for drawing. So maybe the dog can technically sense the river of information that's flowing, but they just don't have the talent for doing it. Whereas,
or talent to interpret it, or
right. I don't know. Something's there. I don't know what it is. Something is there.
Now, see, if you don't need physicalism, then you have a lot more leeway. For instance, there's also dualism. There's a physical universe. That means there's stuff in it that's independent of our mind, and we can predict things about it using models, whatever. But then there's also a component that's not being simulated by the physical universe that is mind stuff. And the important thing about it is mind stuff doesn't necessarily have to be located in a place. So it's sharing information potentially with all other locations in the physical world. That would make sense then why you could get information from across two mm-hmm. points in space. Real quick, metaphysical consciousness is a weird thing, and one of its apparently inherent qualities, if it even exists, and actually it transcends the concept of existence anyway, is it doesn't exchange any information anywhere. So it doesn't matter.
So you called that
dualism.
Dualism?
So dualism, I think, officially, it's like the most common belief. You have people's mind, so consciousness, metaphysical consciousness, is attached to people. Mm-hmm. Picture this. There's a person over there. Why aren't you viewing their perspective? Well, the information for your perspective is actually in your head. If you were viewing it from their perspective, it would actually be their perspective. Metaphysical consciousness is why you have, it's actually not why anything. Metaphysical consciousness is nothing. Ignore every time I say metaphysical consciousness. Your consciousness is attached to your process. Their consciousness is attached to their process. Why isn't it the case that you can view a rock's perspective? It has no brain, right? Mm-hmm. Why can't you just briefly share a perspective with something else? You know, a different person, you get information from them. Well, because the information doesn't transfer. In dualism, they're saying the metaphysical consciousness, essentially, your metaphysical consciousness is it the same thing as your perceived consciousness? So the consciousness that is actually doing the perceiving. In that case, there is information exchange. In dualism, you could potentially share experience across anything. Like your mind to a rock, your mind to a location, your mind just to a general time or a person or an animal or whatever. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so dualism is I think officially the default, like most people believe this because of the distinction between your experiential consciousness, which is just like a description. I'm experiencing this. This is my consciousness. And metaphysical consciousness. Again, ignore every time I say metaphysical consciousness. In dualism, there's no difference between the two. I mean, that's what I'm taking out of it there is no metaphysical consciousness in dualism. Your mind is your mind, it's your experiential consciousness, it's not attached to your physical body. In physicalism, you have a metaphysical consciousness, but it does nothing. It's nothing.
Oh, lovely.
Like the best way I could say it, again, it's like transcends the idea of existence, but it is just the state of the information in your brain. That obviously exists. I mean, that particular configuration of atoms or whatever, in that configuration, the configuration exists. You can think about it, you can say, this is the configuration of the atoms in my brain, whatever. And you could transfer that to different atoms. Like if you change the atoms in a different brain in a physical universe, in a physicalist universe, and they would become you, essentially. But not also.
Oh my God.
It's crazy shit, basically.
That is crazy.
There's also a third consciousness, which is your soul consciousness, whatever you want to say. That is basically the stand-in for the dualist mind in physicalism. So like you have a soul, it's only weakly attached to your body, so it can go and do other things, and that's where your consciousness really is. But your brain also has a consciousness, it's so like you can have a person without a soul floating around, doing other things or attached to them. In that same physicalist universe, you also have a metaphysical consciousness. Ignore that. But that's like the compromise if you don't have dualism. Dualism is, again, saying it's not a soul, it's a mind that's not simulated by the physical universe. A soul is simulated by the physical universe in a physicalist universe. So anyway.
I just had a thought. When talking about something you said, I'm not exactly sure what made me think of this. When talking about a psychic experience, you're talking about what is the reason for it. So you could say, if you just merely know something, that would be more like prophecy. And in the model you were just describing, that would be just that you could see from another perspective, correct? So
wait, what?
So, for instance, if you say, like my mom's story of waking up, having a sense she was wet and cold, and being concerned about my brother, and it turned out he had capsized, that wasn't really a message. That was more being able to pick up something that was occurring. It just was.
Like experiencing something.
It just merely was. It would be like if you said, I have this idea that the dog is going to jump out of the back of the truck and get choked. That almost, though, is a message, because there is some difference. There's some distinction between whether you're looking at something from another perspective, whether it's in time or space, or you're just merely, you just have this thought. It's a message.
Yeah. So, like even ignoring the concept of a message being sent by another entity, whatever, meaning through information having been sent. Like presumably you could have information that has absolutely no meaning.
Right.
Like, oh, this is the random motion of a leaf over there, and it means nothing, so you don't even think about it. There is another thing that brings up that, say you're in a physicalist universe, like the hyper meta gods come down and say, you're in a physicalist universe, and then they disappear. So 100% you can predict everything. Just everything predictable. Even you crack quantum physics, all of it's predictable. And then you have a premonition, or you see something clairvoyantly. The only thing that has to happen there is some inexplicable thing happens, and you get the information. Your brain changes somehow. Like particles just randomly get impulses or whatever, and now you can see the thing, or you have some information. Keep in mind, the entire universe is inexplicable. There's there's doubly no inherently reason why an inexplicable thing shouldn't happen. Like even in a physicalist universe, you can explain everything. Oh, look, a completely inexplicable thing happens. Like imagine if you did briefly flash the perspective from somebody else. So you got the information, you could remember, yeah, I saw from their perspective. Why not? I mean, really, like, why wouldn't you? Why are you even viewing it from your fucking perspective? So, creepiness aside, that means psychics are pretty cool.
Well, I'm a believer. I've had psychic experiences myself, and my mom told me stories about hers. So maybe, unless it's happened to you, you won't understand. Has it happened to you?
No, not yet.
Well, if it's happened to anybody listening, I want them to contact us and tell us, because I want to hear their experiences. Our contact information is in the show notes, and as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.